A woman receives an anonymous love letter and discovers it's from a childhood friend she thought had died. Then, upon meeting him, a major secret is revealed that leaves her stunned. Dolores Allard held the letter with trembling hands, the delicate paper crinkling slightly beneath her fingers. The wax seal, now broken, felt like a relic from another time, remnants of a world where letters carried promises of love, hope, and sometimes unbearable pain. As she stared at the uneven edges of the broken seal, she caught a faint whiff of ink. The scent was subtle, but it stirred something deep within her, a cascade of memories she had carefully hidden away for decades. Settling into her worn armchair, she unfolded the letter with deliberate care, as though the fragile paper might crumble under the weight of her touch. Her eyes scanned the elegant script, the familiar curves of the handwriting pulling her back through time. She read the opening line again, her heart pounding as though it were the first time. "My dearest Dolores." The words carried a tenderness that was impossible to mistake, a restrained passion that felt like a ghost whispering across the years. She clenched the letter tightly, her mind racing to make sense of it. This was no forgery. The hand that wrote this letter was one she would have recognized anywhere. Hector Reynolds. His name echoed in her thoughts like a refrain from a long-lost melody. Hector, the boy with sunlit eyes who had once promised her the world under the old oak tree at the edge of the meadow. Hector, whose death in the distant jungles of Vietnam had shattered her youthful dreams, leaving her with a hollow ache that never fully healed. She whispered his name aloud, testing it on her lips as if speaking it might summon him. Hector. But how could it be? He was gone. She had mourned him, clung to the grief like a widow to her wedding band, and yet here it was, a letter in his unmistakable handwriting. Every loop and curve in the ink was distinctly his. Dolores leaned forward, reading the letter again and again, her breath quickening. The details in the words pierced through the fog of disbelief, small, intimate secrets they had shared in those fleeting, blissful days before the world pulled them apart. Only Hector could have known them. Her pulse thudded in her ears, a cacophony of disbelief and fragile hope. Was it possible that he was alive? Had he somehow survived? And if so, why had he stayed away for all these years? She couldn't face this alone. The questions clawed at her, demanding answers. With trembling resolve, she reached for the phone and called her oldest friend, Emma Williams. Emma arrived that afternoon, her practical demeanor softened by curiosity as Dolores handed her the letter. "Well, let's see what has you so flustered," Emma said, taking the letter and adjusting her glasses. Her eyes moved over the page, her expression shifting from skepticism to astonishment. By the time she finished, she looked at Dolores with wide eyes. This is impossible," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. She glanced back at the letter as if to confirm what she'd read. "It can't be him, Dolores. Hector's been gone for, what, 50 years? Dolores nodded, her voice breaking as she replied, I know it sounds crazy, but Emma, look at the handwriting. You remember his letters, don't you? The way he always wrote my name, how he would curl the D just so. It's him. I'd know it anywhere." Emma examined the letter again, her brow furrowing. She flipped it over, inspected the edges, even smelled the paper, as if searching for an explanation. "But what does it mean?" she asked finally, looking back at Dolores. "If it is Hector, why would he send this now? Where has he been all this time?" "I don't know," Dolores admitted, her hands gripping the armrests of her chair. "But if there's even the slightest chance he's alive, Emma, I have to find him. I have to know the truth." Emma placed the letter down and took Dolores's hand, her gaze steady and full of quiet resolve. "Then we'll figure this out together. You can't go chasing after ghosts on your own, Dolores. If there's truth to this, we'll uncover it." Dolores's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed Emma's hand. "He was everything to me, Emma, everything. I've lived my life, raised a family, but Hector, losing him was like losing a part of myself. If he's alive, I have to see him again." Emma nodded, her voice gentle but firm. Then let's start with the letter. There must be something here that can help us. The two women pored over the letter, scrutinizing every word, every nuance, hoping to find a clue to its origins. Though the letter was brief, its content hinted at a love that had endured through decades of silence. Hector had written about the creek where they used to meet, the meadow where they shared their first kiss, and the promises they made under the stars. It was both a declaration of love and a plea for understanding. I had to leave, Dolores, but I never stopped loving you. Not for a single moment. I only hope it's not too late to tell you what's in my heart. Emma leaned back, folding her arms. This is strange, Dolores. If he's alive, why didn't he come to you directly? Why a letter after all this time? I don't know, Dolores said, shaking her head, but I'm going to find out. Emma studied her friend's determined expression and sighed. All right, but we need more than just this letter. Let's think. Who might know something? Does Hector have any family left in town? Dolores's mind raced. Victor, she said softly. The name hung in the air like a shadow. Emma's expression darkened. Victor Reynolds, his brother. He's always been difficult. You think he'd help? I don't know, Dolores admitted, her voice faltering. But it's a place to start. If anyone knows what happened to Hector, it's Victor. The two women shared a look of determination. The letter had opened a door to the past, and behind it lay a mystery they were only beginning to uncover. Dolores took the letter from the table and held it close to her chest, her voice steady now, as she said, I'm going to find him, Emma, no matter what it takes. Emma nodded. Then let's get started. The questions burned in Dolores's mind as the memory of Hector's name reverberated through her soul. Was it truly him? And if it was, what would she find at the end of her search? The journey to uncover the truth had begun. The following morning, Dolores Allard walked into the town's library with a purposeful stride. She clutched her handbag tightly, the letter tucked safely inside, though she'd read it so many times by now that its words seemed permanently etched in her mind. The library smelled faintly of paper and ink, a quiet haven where stories from the past lived on in the shelves. Barbara Parker, the librarian, glanced up from the counter as Dolores approached. Barbara was a petite woman in her 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to read more than just books. Good morning, Dolores, Barbara said with a polite smile. What brings you here today? Dolores hesitated briefly, then reached into her bag, pulling out the letter. She laid it gently on the counter, as though it might shatter under too much pressure. Barbara, I need some help, Dolores began, her voice steady but low. I received this letter recently, and it's from someone I thought was gone. Barbara raised an eyebrow, leaning in slightly as she unfolded the letter and scanned its contents. As her eyes moved over the elegant script, her expression shifted from curiosity to intrigue. This handwriting, it's beautiful, Barbara murmured. Who wrote it? Hector Reynolds, Dolores said quietly, her heart skipping at the sound of his name aloud. Barbara froze, then looked up sharply. Hector Reynolds. The same Hector Reynolds who... Yes, Dolores interrupted. The same Hector Reynolds who was declared dead in Vietnam over 50 years ago. Barbara's lips parted, but no words came out at first. Finally, she placed the letter back on the counter. Dolores, I don't understand. How is this possible? I don't know yet, Dolores admitted, her voice trembling slightly. That's why I'm here. I need to find answers. Anything about his family, his whereabouts, anything. Barbara nodded slowly, her fingers tapping thoughtfully on the counter. Reynolds. My father used to mention that name. They had a farm, just off the old road on the edge of town. I remember him talking about it. Dolores leaned in, her pulse quickening. Do you know if anyone from the family still lives there? Barbara frowned, her brow furrowing as she considered the question. Victor Reynolds, Hector's younger brother. He still lives on that property, or so I've heard. The mention of Victor's name sent a cold shiver through Dolores's spine. Her fingers gripped the edge of the counter. Victor, Barbara noticed the shift in Dolores's demeanor and tilted her head. "You knew him, didn't you?" Dolores nodded slowly. "He was different from Hector, always distant. There was something dark about him. He didn't like me much, or anyone close to Hector for that matter." Barbara leaned back, crossing her arms. "That sounds about right. Victor's reputation isn't exactly warm. People around here say he's kept to himself for years, barely leaves the farm. You'll have a hard time getting answers from him." "I have to try," Dolores said firmly, determination hardening her features. Barbara studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. "Well, if anyone knows what happened to Hector, it's him. But be careful, Dolores. Victor's not someone to be taken lightly." Dolores thanked Barbara, tucking the letter back into her bag and leaving the library with a new sense of purpose and unease. The name Victor had reopened memories she had buried alongside Hector's. He had always been a shadow in her happiest moments with Hector, lurking on the edges with a bitterness she never fully understood. Still, Dolores couldn't let fear stop her. She needed answers, and if Victor Reynolds held even a piece of the truth, she was willing to face him. Her next stop was the sheriff's office, a small building just off Main Street. Sheriff James Thompson was seated behind his desk when she entered, his hat tilted back as he read over a stack of paperwork. He looked up as she approached, his lined face breaking into a warm, familiar smile. "Dolores," he greeted her. "What brings you in today?" She didn't waste any time, pulling out the letter and placing it on his desk. "I need your help, James." The sheriff's smile faded as he picked up the letter, his eyes narrowing as he read. The room was silent except for the rustling of the paper. When he finally looked up, his expression was unreadable. "Hector Reynolds," he said slowly. "I remember when the news came that he died in the war. It was a hard loss for this town. It was more than a loss for me," Dolores said quietly. "And now I have this letter. I don't know how or why, but James, it's him. I need to know if he's still out there." The sheriff leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming on the armrest. "Dolores, I can't make promises. This is unusual, to say the least, but I'll look into it, see what I can find." "That's all I ask," Dolores said, meeting his gaze. "I need to know the truth, James, whatever it is." He nodded. "All right, I'll start with Victor Reynolds. If Hector's alive, Victor might know something. But I should warn you, Victor's not exactly cooperative. You'd do best to keep some distance while I handle him." "I understand," Dolores said, though her resolve was clear. She wasn't about to let anyone stop her from uncovering the truth. As she left the office, her mind churned with anticipation and unease. The road ahead felt darker and more uncertain than ever, but one thing was clear. She was closer to finding Hector than she had been in 50 years. The next step was inevitable. Soon she would confront the man who had always stood between her and Hector, the man who might hold the answers she so desperately sought. Weeks passed in a blur of anticipation and uncertainty. Dolores felt the weight of every hour as she waited for news from Sheriff James Thompson. Each day was both a step closer to the truth and a tormenting question mark. When the call finally came, she answered on the first ring. "Dolores," James said, his voice steady but tinged with something she couldn't place. "I found Hector. He's alive." Her knees buckled, and she had to grip the edge of the kitchen counter to keep from falling. The world seemed to tilt as a flood of emotions, relief, disbelief, joy, and fear rushed through her. "Alive?" she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Where?" "He's been living in a cabin near Silverwood Forest," James said gently. "It's isolated, out of the way. He's been there for years." Dolores swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she replied, "I need to see him. I have to see him, James." James hesitated. "Dolores, I'll warn you. He's not the same man you remember. The war, the time, they've taken their toll, but he's alive." That was all Dolores needed to hear. Later that afternoon, she shared the news with her son Carl, whose brow furrowed with concern as she spoke. "Mama," Carl began, his voice cautious, I know this is important to you, but what if this isn't what you're expecting? Dolores looked at him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. I don't have expectations, Carl. I just need answers. I've waited 50 years for this moment. I can't walk away now. Carl sighed, running a hand through his hair. Then I'm going with you. No arguments. She started to protest, but his firm expression stopped her. All right, she said quietly. I'd feel better with you there. The drive to Silverwood Forest was silent, the air in the car heavy with unspoken thoughts. Dolores gripped the letter in her lap, her fingers brushing over the familiar handwriting. Carl kept glancing at her, as if trying to gauge her state of mind, but she stared straight ahead, lost in memories and what-ifs. When they finally reached the cabin, Dolores felt her breath catch. It was small, weathered, and tucked into the shadows of towering trees. The place looked as though it had been untouched by time, yet it exuded a quiet loneliness that mirrored the ache in her heart. Are you ready? Carl asked, his voice soft. Dolores nodded, though her hands trembled as she stepped out of the car. She walked slowly to the cabin, each step echoing with memories of the boy she once knew and the man she might find. She hesitated at the door, her hand raised to knock. For a moment, she thought of turning back. But then she remembered the letter, the unmistakable handwriting, and the love it still carried. Summoning her courage, she knocked. The sound of her fist against the wood seemed impossibly loud, shattering the stillness of the forest. Seconds stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then the door creaked open. Dolores's heart nearly stopped. The man standing before her was older, his silver hair falling in uneven strands around a face etched with deep lines. His eyes, those same deep, soulful eyes she remembered, were weary, shadowed by years of pain and isolation. Hector, she whispered, her voice breaking. For a long moment, he simply stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, as recognition flickered in his gaze, he whispered, Dolores. Her tears began to fall, her hand instinctively reaching out. Hector didn't move, as though he couldn't trust what he was seeing. I thought I'd never see you again, he said, his voice rough and low. Dolores stepped closer, clutching the letter in her hand. Why? Her voice trembled, a mix of anguish and longing. Why did you write this? Why now, after all these years? Hector's eyes dropped to the ground, his shoulders sagging. Because you needed to know, he said, his voice barely audible. You needed to know that I never stopped loving you. The weight of his words struck her like a blow, and she pressed the letter against her chest. Do you have any idea what it's been like, Hector? Believing you were gone, mourning you for 50 years. He finally met her gaze, his own eyes filled with regret. I thought it was better that way. After the war, I wasn't the same man. I didn't want to burden you with the person I'd become. Dolores shook her head, tears streaming down her face. You were never a burden, Hector. Never. I would have faced anything with you. Behind them, Carl stood silently, watching the emotional reunion unfold. He stepped forward slightly, clearing his throat. Hector, he said gently, I'm Carl, Dolores' son. Hector's eyes widened, flicking between Carl and Dolores. Your son? Yes, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. I got married, had a family, but I never stopped thinking about you. Hector nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. You deserved happiness, Dolores. You deserved everything. And I wanted it with you, she replied, her voice cracking. The air between them was heavy with words left unspoken for decades. Dolores took another step closer, her hand brushing against his arm. For the first time, Hector didn't pull away. I'm not the man you remember, he said quietly. I've lived in the shadows for too long. I don't even know who I am anymore. Dolores held his gaze, her voice steady. Then let me remind you. Let me help you remember. Hector didn't answer, but the faintest glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the cabin, Dolores knew this was just the beginning. The past was alive, raw and unresolved, but there was still time to confront it. They weren't finished, not yet. Dolores and Hector had barely begun to scratch the surface of the emotions and revelations swirling between them when a figure appeared at the edge of the woods. Dolores noticed him first, a tall, angular man stepping into view with slow, deliberate movements. His face was shadowed, but she recognized the sharpness in his gaze as he drew closer. Victor Reynolds. "So," Victor said, his voice sharp and filled with years of pent-up bitterness, "you decided to come back after all." Hector's entire demeanor changed. His body stiffened and his jaw clenched as he stepped slightly in front of Dolores, as though shielding her. The tension between the two men was immediate and suffocating. "I see nothing's changed," Hector said, his voice low but cutting. "You're still lurking in the shadows, Victor." Victor's lips curled into a bitter smile. "And you're still running from them." Dolores stepped forward, her eyes darting between the two men. "Victor," she said firmly, her voice breaking the standoff, "you knew, didn't you?" Victor's gaze shifted to her, and for a brief moment his hardened expression faltered. But the bitterness returned quickly, his words dripping with disdain. "I did what I had to do," Victor replied, avoiding her eyes. "It was better for everyone this way." "Better for everyone?" Hector's voice rose, his anger breaking through his controlled exterior. He took a step toward his brother, his fists clenched. "You knew I was alive. You told them I was dead. You lied to everyone. To her." Victor's face twisted into a sneer. "And what was I supposed to do, Hector? Bring you back so you could take everything? Again?" Dolores stared at Victor in disbelief. "You told people he was dead?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you do something so cruel?" Victor turned to her, his expression a mix of anger and something deeper, something more fragile. "You wouldn't understand, Dolores," he said, his voice quieter now but still laced with bitterness. "Try me," she shot back, her eyes locked on his. Victor hesitated for a moment, then let out a bitter laugh. "Because he always had everything. Everything, Dolores. Our father's approval, the farm, you, and me. I was the shadow, the spare. No one even noticed I was there unless it was to compare me to him." "That's not true," Hector snapped, his voice trembling with frustration. "You were the one father trusted with the farm while I was gone. You could have built something better instead of tearing everything apart out of jealousy." Victor's eyes flared with anger. "Jealousy?" he spat. "You don't know the first thing about what it was like to be left behind, to pick up the pieces while you went off to be a hero. And then, when you came back, broken and useless, I was supposed to just step aside and let you have it all again." "Enough!" Dolores's voice cut through the heated exchange, silencing both men. She stepped forward, her hands trembling but her voice firm. "Victor, this wasn't just about you and Hector. This was my life, too. You stole time from both of us, decades that we can't get back." Victor's face darkened, but he didn't look at her. Instead, he stared at the ground, his hands clenched at his sides. "You don't understand what it was like," he muttered. "Always being second, always being the one left behind." Dolores shook her head, her voice softening slightly. "I do understand pain, Victor. I've lived with it every day since I thought Hector was gone. But what you did wasn't about protecting anyone. It was selfish, and it hurt us all." Hector stepped closer to Victor, his voice calmer now but no less intense. "You took everything from me, Victor. I came back from that war a broken man, and instead of helping me, you buried me. You made sure I had nothing and no one. Why?" Victor looked up at his brother, his face twisting in anguish. "Because I thought you didn't deserve it anymore. You left, Hector. You left me to deal with father, the farm, the debts. You abandoned us." "I didn't abandon you," Hector said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was drafted. I didn't have a choice. And when I came back, I didn't even recognize myself. I was trying to figure out how to rebuild my life. And you thought you could just waltz back in and pick up where you left off?" Victor retorted bitterly. "I wasn't going to let that happen. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Dolores turned to Hector, her heart aching at the raw pain in his eyes. "Hector," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "I had no idea." He shook his head, his gaze fixed on Victor. "It's not your fault, Dolores. Victor made sure you'd never know." Victor's expression shifted, the bitterness giving way to something more vulnerable. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said quietly, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Dolores said firmly, "you didn't. You let jealousy and anger consume you, and you tore apart lives in the process." Victor took a step back, his shoulders slumping. For the first time, he looked like a man carrying the weight of his actions. Hector turned to Dolores, his voice heavy with emotion. "I can't change what happened, but I can try to make things right now, if you'll let me." Dolores nodded, her hand tightening around his. "We'll figure it out together. But Hector, this isn't just about us anymore. Victor's choices have left wounds that need healing." Victor looked up at his brother, something unspoken passing between them. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said finally, his voice almost a whisper. "But I needed you to know. I thought I was doing what I had to." Hector's face softened slightly, but his voice was resolute. "You need to live with what you did, Victor. But if you want to make it right, you have to start by being honest, with yourself and with everyone you hurt." Victor nodded slowly, his gaze dropping once more. As he turned to leave, Dolores watched him disappear back into the woods, a mixture of anger and pity churning in her chest. Hector let out a long breath, his shoulders sagging. "He'll never change," he said quietly. Dolores squeezed his hand. "Maybe not, but we have." Their journey was far from over, but for the first time in decades, Dolores felt that the path ahead was clearer. That night, the silence in the cabin was palpable. Dolores, Hector, and Carl sat around the small wooden table, its surface worn smooth by time. A single lamp cast a dim light, its glow revealing the lines etched deeply into Hector's face. He seemed to struggle with the weight of his own story, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Dolores reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. "Hector," she said gently, "I need to understand. What happened to you after the war? Why didn't you come back to us?" Hector hesitated, his gaze fixed on the table. Finally, he drew a deep breath and began to speak, his voice low and steady, as though pulling the words from a place he had buried long ago. "After Vietnam," he started, "I wasn't the same. The things I saw there, the things I did, they stayed with me. I thought I could come back and pick up where I left off. I thought I could be the same man you once knew." He looked up at Dolores, his eyes clouded with pain. "But I wasn't that man anymore. I was haunted, angry. I didn't know how to face you or anyone else. So I didn't." Dolores listened intently, her heart aching with each word. "You could have talked to me," she said softly. "I would have helped you. We could have faced it together." Hector shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want anyone to. I thought it was better for you to think I was gone than to know what I'd become." Dolores opened her mouth to respond, but Carl spoke up for the first time, his voice calm but firm. "Running away isn't the same as protecting someone, Hector," he said. "You didn't make things better by disappearing. You just made them lonelier." Hector turned to Carl, his expression filled with a mix of guilt and gratitude. "You're right," he admitted. "It wasn't easier. It was just quiet, and quiet was all I thought I could handle." Dolores leaned forward, her voice trembling but resolute. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore. I'm here now. We're here." She glanced at Carl, who nodded in agreement. Hector looked at her, the smallest glimmer of hope appearing in his weary eyes. "I never stopped loving you, Dolores," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "Even when I stayed away, even when I convinced myself it was for the best, you were always with me." Tears welled in Dolores's eyes, but she held his gaze. "Then let's make this right," she said. "Let's take back what we can." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was no longer suffocating. There was a sense of unspoken understanding between them, a fragile but genuine connection being rebuilt after years of separation. Carl cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "So what happens now?" he asked, his tone pragmatic but kind. Hector rubbed his hands together, his brow furrowed in thought. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'm tired of hiding. If I've learned anything from today, it's that running doesn't solve anything. I need to face what I've been avoiding." Dolores nodded, her expression firm. "We'll face it together." As the night wore on, Hector opened up about the war, the vivid memories he had tried so hard to suppress. He spoke of the friends he had lost, the guilt that weighed on him for surviving, and the fear that he would never feel whole again. Dolores listened with an open heart, her pain for him deepening with every story. When Hector's voice faltered, Carl spoke again, his words thoughtful. "Hector," he said, "what happened to you wasn't your fault. But you don't have to carry it alone anymore. There are people who can help. You just have to let them." Hector nodded slowly, the truth of Carl's words sinking in. "Maybe," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's time I stop running." Dolores reached across the table, her hand covering his. "It's time to come home, Hector, in every way that matters." As they sat together, the bonds of the past began to mend, though they all knew the journey ahead would be long and fraught with challenges. Still, the love between Hector and Dolores, buried but never extinguished, was beginning to shine through the cracks. What they didn't realize was that the forest surrounding them still held secrets. Secrets tied to Victor, whose actions would soon come to light. The days after Hector's revelations were marked by long, painful conversations. For Dolores and Hector, each exchange felt like peeling back the layers of a wound that had festered for decades. The more they spoke, the more they confronted the ghosts of their shared past. Hector opened up about the war in vivid, harrowing detail. One evening, as they sat side by side on the creaking porch of his cabin, he recounted his memories with a voice heavy with sorrow. "There wasn't a single moment of peace over there," he said, staring into the dark woods. "The chaos. It was constant. The fear was always with us, like a shadow. Every step I took, I thought it might be my last. And then, when it wasn't, I felt guilty. Guilty for coming back when so many others didn't." Dolores listened quietly, her hand resting lightly on his arm. She could feel the tension radiating from him, the years of bottled-up pain seeping through his words. "It didn't stop when I left the battlefield," Hector continued. "I carried it with me, in my mind, in my body. I wasn't just coming home, I was dragging every nightmare with me." He paused, his voice faltering. "That's why I stayed away. I didn't know how to be the man you remembered. I didn't think I deserved to be." Dolores tightened her grip on his arm, her voice soft but resolute. "You don't understand, Hector. I never needed you to be perfect. I would have taken you as you were, broken pieces and all, the pain, the darkness. I would have faced it all with you." Hector turned to her, his eyes filled with guilt and longing. "I thought I was protecting you," he said. "I thought if you believed I was gone, you'd move on, have the life you deserved." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "But I never moved on, Hector. Not really. Losing you wasn't something I got over. It was something I carried every single day." Hector lowered his gaze, unable to meet her eyes. "I see that now," he said quietly. "I should have trusted you. I should have come back." Dolores reached for his hand, intertwining her fingers with his. "We can't change the past," she said, "but we have this moment. We have now." As the conversation lulled, the silence was filled with unspoken understanding. Hector wasn't fully healed, not yet, but the walls he had built around himself were beginning to crack. Meanwhile, Victor's presence had become an unsettling constant. Dolores noticed him lingering on the edges of the property, sometimes pacing in the distance, other times standing motionless as though debating whether to approach. At first, Hector ignored him entirely. But Dolores couldn't shake the feeling that Victor wanted to say something, even if he didn't know how. One afternoon, as Hector repaired the porch railing, Dolores approached him with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think he's sorry?" she asked, nodding toward the woods where Victor had been seen earlier. Hector didn't look up from his work, but his shoulders tensed. He let out a heavy sigh before answering. "Sorry?" he repeated, his tone bitter. "Maybe, but Victor's never been one to admit when he's wrong, not once in his life." Dolores frowned, crossing her arms. "I don't know, he's been acting different, hesitant." Hector finally set down his tools and looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Victor doesn't hesitate, Dolores, not unless he's trying to figure out how to twist a situation to his advantage." "Maybe," she conceded, "but he seems troubled, like he's carrying something." Hector snorted, shaking his head. "He's been carrying bitterness his whole life. That's nothing new." Despite Hector's dismissal, Dolores couldn't ignore what she had observed. Victor avoided her gaze whenever she caught him watching, and there was a tension in his posture that hinted at inner conflict. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Victor ventured closer than usual. Dolores watched from the porch as he paced near the edge of the woods, his movements restless. Hector stepped outside, and she gestured toward Victor. "There he is again," she said softly. Hector's jaw tightened as he glanced in his brother's direction. "If he wants something, he can come and say it. I'm not going out there." Dolores hesitated, then rose from her chair. "Maybe he's waiting for someone to reach out." "Don't!" Hector warned, his voice sharper than usual. "He's not worth it, Dolores, not after everything he's done." But she was already walking down the steps. "Someone has to break this cycle, Hector," she said over her shoulder. As Dolores approached Victor, she noticed the way his hands fidgeted, a rare sign of nervousness. He stopped pacing as she neared, but didn't look up. "Victor," she said firmly, "if you have something to say, say it." He glanced at her, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. For a moment it seemed like he might speak, but then he shook his head and turned away. "Victor," she called again, her tone softening, "this isn't just about you. Hector and I are trying to move forward. If you're holding on to something, it's time to let it out." He stopped, but didn't turn around. "You think it's that simple?" he said finally, his voice low and bitter. "I don't know what I think," Dolores replied, "because you won't tell me." Victor sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "You don't know the half of it, Dolores," he muttered before walking back into the woods. When Dolores returned to the porch, Hector was waiting with a knowing look. "I told you," he said, though there was no satisfaction in his tone. Dolores sat beside him, her expression thoughtful. "He's hiding something, Hector. Something big." Hector leaned back in his chair, his eyes fixed on the tree line where Victor had disappeared. "He always has been. But if you're waiting for him to confess, don't hold your breath." As the night deepened, Dolores couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's silence was more than just stubbornness. He carried a weight that was slowly unraveling, and she was determined to uncover what it was, even if it meant confronting the darkest corners of their shared past. Morning light filtered softly through the trees as Hector and Carl worked on the roof of the cabin. Hector had taken on the task with surprising vigor, and Carl, ever dutiful, stayed close, handing him tools and offering steady support. The rhythmic hammering echoed faintly in the quiet, broken only by occasional murmurs between father and son. Nearby, Dolores knelt in the small garden by the house, her hands gently pressing soil around the roots of flowers she hadn't tended to in years. She'd chosen them carefully, lilies and daisies, the ones she and Hector had loved in their youth. As she worked, the crunch of footsteps on dry leaves reached her ears. Without turning, she spoke. "You're persistent. I'll give you that." Victor's voice came from behind her, hesitant but clear. "I want to talk." Dolores paused, brushing dirt from her hands onto her skirt. Slowly, she stood and turned to face him. His frame was as familiar as it was imposing, but there was something different about his posture. an unease that made him seem smaller, almost unsure of himself. "Finally," she said simply, wiping her hands as she gestured toward a nearby bench. Victor hesitated, then followed her lead, sitting beside her on the makeshift seat. His movements were stiff, and he avoided her gaze, his hands gripping his knees as though to steady himself. "I've done things," he began, his voice rough. "Things I'm not proud of." Dolores didn't respond immediately, her silence an invitation for him to continue. She had learned over the years that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. "When Hector came back," Victor said, staring at the ground, "he was different, broken maybe, and I was angry. Angry at him for leaving in the first place, angry at him for coming back like that." Dolores tilted her head slightly, her voice calm but probing. "Angry at him for what, Victor? Surviving?" Victor's hands tightened into fists, the knuckles whitening. "Maybe. I don't know," he admitted. "It wasn't fair. He had everything, father's respect, the farm, you, and then he left us to deal with the mess. And so you lied," Dolores said, her tone sharper now. "You told everyone he was dead." Victor flinched at her words, but nodded slowly. "Yes, I told them he was gone, and I let them believe it. I thought maybe it would be easier that way, for everyone. Not for me," she said firmly, her gaze boring into him. "Do you have any idea what that did to me? To him?" Victor's face twisted in anguish. "I know," he said quietly, and it didn't stop there. Dolores stiffened, her heart quickening. "What else, Victor?" she asked, leaning closer. He hesitated, the weight of the truth visibly bearing down on him. Finally he spoke, his voice barely audible. "The farm. Our father left it to Hector. I found out after he came back. I knew he wouldn't stay, not the way he was, so I made sure it stayed mine." Dolores stared at him, her expression a mix of disbelief and fury. "You manipulated everything," she said, her voice cold. Victor nodded, his shoulders slumping. "Yes, I made sure the papers never reached him. I convinced the lawyer Hector didn't want it. And when he disappeared, I let it happen. I told myself it was fair, that I deserved it." She leaned back, folding her arms as she studied him. "You convinced yourself of a lot of things, didn't you?" Victor's voice cracked as he replied, "It didn't make me happy, Dolores. It didn't give me what I thought it would. Every time I looked at that land, I knew what I'd done. It's destroyed me more than anything else could." Dolores stood abruptly, her anger barely contained. "You destroyed more than yourself, Victor. You destroyed lives. You stole decades, time that Hector and I can never get back." Victor looked up at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I know," he said hoarsely. "I know I can't fix it. I needed you to know the truth." Dolores shook her head, stepping away from him. "The truth doesn't undo the damage," she said, her voice trembling. "It doesn't erase what you've done." She turned to leave, but paused, looking back at him. "If you're looking for forgiveness, Victor, you won't find it here. Not yet." Victor watched her walk away, his expression a mix of guilt and resignation. He remained seated on the bench, his head bowed as though the weight of his confession had finally crushed him. Back at the cabin, Dolores found Hector and Carl coming down from the roof, their hands covered in dust and grime. Hector noticed her troubled expression immediately. "What happened?" he asked, setting his tools aside. "Victor," she said, her voice tight. "He finally talked." Hector's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "And?" "He admitted to everything," Dolores replied, her tone bitter. "The lies, the manipulation, even the farm. It was yours, Hector. Father left it to you, and Victor made sure you never knew." Carl stepped forward, his expression incredulous. "Are you serious? He stole it?" "Yes," Dolores said, "and he convinced himself it was justified." Hector exhaled sharply, his hands curling into fists. "Of course he did," he muttered. Dolores placed a hand on his arm. "He says he regrets it, that it's been eating him alive all these years." "Good," Hector said flatly. "Let it." Carl looked between them, his brow furrowed. So what now? Do we confront him? Take the farm back? Hector shook his head, his expression grim. That farm doesn't matter anymore. What matters is, he has to live with what he's done, just like I've had to live with what he took from me. Dolores nodded, though her mind was still racing. Victor's confession had shed light on the depths of his betrayal, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to uncover, more secrets buried in the shadows of their past. That night, as the lantern's light flickered in the cabin, Dolores sat across from Hector. The silence between them was heavy, laden with the weight of Victor's confession. Hector seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on the grain of the wooden table, but Dolores couldn't let it go. "You knew, didn't you?" she finally asked, her voice steady but firm. "You knew he kept the farm." Hector's head lifted slightly, his expression calm, almost resigned. "I figured as much," he said. "It's who Victor is." Dolores leaned forward, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "Why didn't you fight him? It was your inheritance, Hector, your home." Hector gave a slight shrug, his voice tinged with a tired acceptance. "What would have been the point? I wasn't in any shape to run a farm, Dolores. I didn't have anything to give, not to the land, not to him, not to you." Dolores's eyes narrowed, her tone softening but still pointed. "You had more than you realized. You always did." Hector sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Maybe, but back then, it didn't feel that way. Victor wanted it, and I let him have it. It wasn't worth the fight. Not with everything else I was dealing with." She fell silent for a moment, her mind turning over Victor's words from earlier that day. There was something about his confession, something that didn't sit right. It was as though the pieces didn't quite fit together. "Hector," she said carefully, "Victor's not telling us everything. I can feel it." He looked at her, his brow furrowing. "What more is there to tell? He lied, he stole, he manipulated. That's Victor." Dolores shook her head. "It's not just about the farm. There's something else. Something bigger." Hector didn't respond, but the doubt in his eyes mirrored her own. The next morning, unable to shake the nagging feeling in her chest, Dolores set out for a walk. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, its paths overgrown and wild. She let her feet carry her as her mind replayed the events of the past few days. Victor's words gnawed at her. "It's been eating me alive all these years." What could he have meant? What could possibly weigh on him more than what he had already confessed? As she wandered deeper into the woods, she noticed something unusual. A structure partially hidden by vines and overgrown foliage. The outline of a barn or a shed loomed in the distance, weathered and forgotten. Curiosity propelled her forward. The closer she got, the more the building came into view. It was a barn, its wooden walls grey and cracked with age, the roof sagging in places. The air felt heavier here, charged with an unspoken history. Dolores hesitated for only a moment before stepping closer. She pushed the door, its hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the stale scent of mildew and decay hit her like a wave. Dust particles floated lazily in the dim light streaming through gaps in the walls. Her eyes scanned the space, taking in the scattered debris, old tools, broken furniture, and a pile of papers beneath a heavy tarp. Something about the papers drew her attention. Pulling back the tarp, she found a disorganized heap of documents. Most were brittle with age, their edges yellowed and torn. Among them were letters, deeds, and at the bottom of the pile, a small, leather-bound book. Dolores picked up the book with trembling hands. As she opened it, she realized it was a journal. The first few pages were filled with neat, controlled handwriting she immediately recognized as Victor's. But as she flipped further, the handwriting became erratic, the ink darker, as though pressed into the paper with force. Her breath caught as she read one entry. "I told everyone he was dead, but it wasn't enough." The words were scrawled in thick, uneven strokes, almost desperate. Dolores's heart began to race as she continued reading. "I saw him come back. He was lost, a shell of himself. But instead of helping him, I pushed him away. I told him he wasn't welcome. I told him he was dead to me." Her hands trembled as she turned the page, the words becoming even more frantic. "If I hadn't done it, maybe he would have stayed. Maybe he could have found peace. But I couldn't let him take everything again." Dolores sank to her knees, her breath shallow. The truth hit her like a blow. Victor hadn't just lied to the town. He had deliberately driven Hector away, ensuring he had no reason to stay, no reason to fight for what was his. Tears blurred her vision as she read the final lines of the entry, the ink smudged as though the page had been dampened by tears. "I thought it would make things better. I thought it would make me feel whole. But it didn't. It only broke me more." Dolores closed the journal and sat back on the cold, damp floor of the barn. Her tears fell freely now, a mix of anger and sorrow. Victor's betrayal ran deeper than she had imagined. He hadn't just stolen the farm. He had stolen Hector's chance to heal, to rebuild his life, to come back to the people who loved him. She clutched the journal to her chest, her mind reeling. The man who had caused so much pain was a product of his own bitterness and insecurities. And yet, knowing this didn't lessen the weight of what he had done. Dolores stood, her resolve hardening. She needed to confront Victor again, but this time it wouldn't be for answers. It would be for accountability. With the journal tucked under her arm, she made her way back to the cabin, the cold truth pressing against her heart with every step. Dolores walked back to the cabin, the leather-bound journal clutched tightly in her hands. Her steps were purposeful, her heart pounding with the weight of what she had uncovered. By the time she reached the porch, Hector and Victor were already there. They stood apart, their postures rigid, the tension between them thick enough to cut. Victor leaned against the wooden railing, his face guarded, but his eyes betraying a flicker of unease. Hector sat in a chair, staring out at the trees, his expression unreadable, but his fists clenched tightly on his lap. Dolores stepped onto the porch and placed the journal on the small table between them with deliberate force. Both men looked at her, startled by her abrupt entrance. "I found this in the barn," she said evenly, her gaze moving from Hector to Victor. Victor's face paled immediately. His hand twitched as though he might reach for the journal, but he stopped himself. Hector, on the other hand, didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Victor, unblinking, unrelenting. "You lied to me, didn't you?" Hector's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the pain laced in his words. "From the very beginning, you lied about everything." Victor's throat worked as he struggled to form a response. I did what I thought was right," he stammered, his voice wavering. "Right!" Hector's voice rose, his anger finally breaking through. He stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the porch. "You thought stealing my life was right." Victor took a step back, his hands raised defensively. "You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Hector interrupted, his voice sharp. "You told the world I was dead. You drove me away when I came back. You took the farm, the inheritance, my chance at a future. And you think that was right?" Victor looked desperately at Dolores, as if hoping for her intervention. But she crossed her arms, her expression cold. "You need to face this, Victor," she said firmly. "There's no escaping it now." Victor's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. Slowly he lowered himself to his knees, his head bowing as though he could no longer bear the guilt. "I was bitter, Hector," he admitted, his voice breaking. "I was a bitter, angry man. I had everything I thought I wanted, but it never felt like enough. I watched you leave and come back, and all I could think about was how you always seemed to have the things I couldn't." Hector stared at him, his jaw clenched, his fists trembling at his sides. "So you took them," he said bitterly. "You decided to take everything from me because of your own insecurities." Victor nodded, his voice barely audible. "Yes, I told myself you didn't deserve it, that you didn't deserve the farm, the love, the life I thought should have been mine." He raised his head slightly, his eyes filled with anguish. "But I was wrong, Hector. So wrong. All I did was ruin everything. For you, for me, for everyone. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the sounds of the forest seemed to fade as the weight of Victor's confession settled over them. Dolores finally spoke, her tone sharp but steady. "You didn't just hurt Hector, Victor, you hurt me. You stole years, decades of our lives. And for what? To soothe your own bitterness?" Victor flinched at her words, his head lowering again. "I know," he whispered, "and I have to live with that." Hector let out a slow, shuddering breath, his hands finally unclenching. "You do," he said quietly. "You have to live with the choices you made. But I can't keep carrying this anger, Victor. I've carried it long enough, even when I didn't know the full truth." Victor looked up at him, his face streaked with tears. Do you forgive me?" Hector hesitated, his expression conflicted. Finally, he spoke, his voice firm but not unkind. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting, Victor. It doesn't mean what you did was okay." He paused, his gaze softening slightly. "But maybe it's the first step towards something better." Victor nodded slowly, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Dolores stepped forward, placing a hand on Hector's arm. "What happens next?" she asked softly. Hector turned to her, his voice steady but weary. "We move forward," he said. "Together, one step at a time." Victor remained on the ground, his head bowed in quiet reflection. Dolores and Hector exchanged a look, a mixture of relief, exhaustion, and hope. The road ahead was uncertain, but they had reached a turning point. For the first time in decades, the truth was out in the open, and the path to healing, though difficult, had begun. The tension in the cabin had quieted, but never fully dissipated. The revelations of the past days hung over Hector, Dolores, and Victor like a storm cloud, heavy and unyielding. Though Victor had confessed much, Dolores couldn't shake the feeling that something else was hidden, buried deep within his guilt. That evening they all gathered in the small living room. Hector sat stiffly in an armchair, his gaze distant, while Dolores perched on the edge of the sofa, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Carl stood near the door, leaning against the frame, silent but watchful. Victor was seated in the corner, his head bowed, fidgeting with the edge of his sleeve. Dolores finally broke the silence. "If there's more, Victor, now is the time to say it. We're owed the truth." Victor looked up, his eyes bloodshot, his hands trembling. For a moment, he seemed ready to deny her accusation, but then his resolve broke. He straightened in his chair, exhaling a shaky breath. "There is something else," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Dolores and Hector exchanged a sharp glance. Carl stepped closer, sensing the gravity of what was about to be revealed. Victor struggled to form the words, his hands trembling as he finally stood. "When Hector came back from the war, he wasn't alone," he began. "He brought a letter with him. Not just any letter, a document." Hector frowned, confusion flickering across his face. "What document?" Victor swallowed hard, the words catching in his throat. "It was a certificate of adoption." The room went still. Dolores froze, her breath caught in her chest. "Adoption," she whispered, the word barely audible. Victor nodded, his face contorted with shame. Hector had a son. He wanted to bring him home. Dolores turned to Hector, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "You had a son?" Hector's face drained of color. I don't know what he's talking about," he stammered. Victor let out a bitter laugh. "You don't remember? You gave me the letter before you left to get things ready. You said you needed to find a place for him, to make sure everything was safe before bringing him back." His voice cracked. "But when you returned, I told you not to bother. I told you no one wanted you here, that you were dead to us. And then," he faltered, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Then what?" Dolores demanded, her voice trembling. Victor's shoulders sagged as he finally admitted, "I burned the letter. I destroyed it. I wanted to erase everything you'd brought back with you." Dolores gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The ground beneath her seemed to vanish as the weight of Victor's actions sank in. Hector stood, his hands gripping the back of his chair for support. His voice was barely above a whisper. "He had a name, didn't he?" Victor nodded, his eyes glistening with tears. "Ryan. His name was Ryan. He'd be about 50 now." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by Hector's ragged breathing. He looked at Dolores, his face stricken with a combination of guilt and anguish. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I didn't know he'd done this. I didn't know I had a son." Dolores's tears spilled over as she stood and moved toward Hector. "You didn't know," she said softly, her hands reaching for his. "But now you do, and we need to find him." Carl, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "Where is he, Victor?" he demanded. "Where's Ryan?" Victor shook his head, collapsing back into his chair. "I don't know," he said hoarsely. "He was in an orphanage when Hector came back. I never checked after that. I didn't want to know." Dolores's voice was sharp and cutting. "You destroyed everything, Victor. Not just Hector's chance to rebuild his life, but Ryan's chance to have a family." Victor dropped his face into his hands, sobbing openly. "I know," he choked out. "I know what I did. I can't take it back." Hector stood motionless, his hands trembling as he absorbed the enormity of what he had just learned. Then, slowly, he straightened. His voice, when he spoke, was steady and resolute. "I need to find him," he said. "If Ryan is still alive, I need to know. I need to try." Dolores nodded, her tears flowing freely now. "We'll find him, Hector. We'll do it together." The search for Ryan began the very next day. Dolores and Hector, with Carl's help, sifted through old records, orphanage archives, and adoption files. They even hired a private investigator whose connections eventually led them to a breakthrough. Months later, they found him. Ryan had been adopted by a family in Houston. He had grown up to become a doctor, specializing in helping veterans recover from trauma, a profession that seemed almost fated. The day Hector met Ryan for the first time was surreal. They arranged to meet at a quiet park. Hector, Dolores, and Carl waited nervously as Ryan approached, a tall man with kind eyes that bore a faint resemblance to Hector's own. "You must be Hector Reynolds," Ryan said, his voice calm but curious. Hector hesitated, his emotions raw. "I am," he said finally. "And I don't know where to begin. I'm so sorry I wasn't there for you." Ryan offered a gentle smile. "You did what you could," he said simply, "and you're here now. That's what matters." Dolores watched from a distance, her heart swelling as she saw the beginnings of a connection she had feared would never happen. Carl stood beside her, his arm around her shoulders, sharing in her quiet joy. Over time, Hector and Ryan began to rebuild the bond they had never been able to forge. Victor, racked with guilt, left the cabin and moved to another town, carrying the weight of his choices but determined to seek his own redemption. For Dolores and Hector, life settled into a new rhythm, one filled with gratitude and second chances. Surrounded by both Ryan and Carl, they cherished every moment they had together. One evening, as Hector and Dolores walked hand in hand along the meadow where their love story had begun, he turned to her with a soft smile. "Do you think we were lucky?" he asked. Dolores looked at him, her eyes shining. "I don't know if it was luck," she said, "but I know love has a way of bringing us back to where we belong." And with that, they walked on. Proof that even the deepest wounds could give way to healing, and even the most fractured lives could find a way to piece themselves back together.